Chapter 1. The Mysterious Invitation. It was a cold evening in London, the kind that seemed to whisper secrets from the fog rolling off the Thames. The year was 1932, and I had just returned to my modest apartment after a tiresome day when the letter arrived. It was an envelope of crisp, white parchment, the seal bearing the insignia of an old friend of mine, Dr. Lambert, a man of medical distinction, and one whom I had met during my time in Belgium. The letter was brief, but it had a gravity to it that I could not ignore. Mon ami Hercule Poirot, I am hosting a gathering of surgeons tomorrow evening at St. Augustine's Hospital. It will be a most intriguing event, one you may find most stimulating. You are invited, of course, as my guest. Yours sincerely, Dr. Lambert. The phrasing seemed odd, even cryptic. But I had known Dr. Lambert long enough to sense when something was amiss, and so I prepared for the gathering with my usual care. St. Augustine's Hospital was one of the most esteemed medical institutions in London, its towering, imposing structure, a symbol of the finest in surgical prowess. I arrived just as the last vestiges of daylight faded into the cold night. The building stood against the misty skyline like a sentinel, and I felt the air thick with unspoken tension as I stepped inside. Inside, the gleaming floors and sterile white walls did little to dispel the strange atmosphere. The hospital, usually a place of calm and order, felt oddly charged that evening. The sounds of hurried footsteps echoed through the long corridors, and there was a faint murmur of voices from behind the closed doors of the surgical suites. Dr. Lambert greeted me at the entrance with a warm smile, though his eyes betrayed something else, something I could not yet name. "Poirot, mon ami, I am so glad you could join us." He extended his hand in a gesture of camaraderie, though there was an edge to his tone. "Always a pleasure, my friend," I replied, noting the slight tension in his posture. "You have called me here for an interesting event, I presume?" "Indeed," Dr. Lambert said, his smile faltering for just a moment. "But it is not without its complications. Come, let me show you to the gathering." The room where the surgeons were assembled was filled with prominent figures of the medical world. They stood in tight clusters, discussing among themselves with a sense of purpose that bordered on the manic. There were whispers, a peculiar hum of voices, but no one seemed to be addressing the elephant in the room. As I observed them, my eyes fell upon a man standing alone near the corner, Dr. Edmund. Mallory, a well-known and highly respected surgeon, appeared deep in thought, his brow furrowed, his hands twitching nervously. His reputation preceded him. Mallory had once been hailed as one of the finest minds in surgery. Yet there he stood, almost isolated, as though wrestling with a conflict far deeper than any professional matter. "Poirot," Dr. Lambert said, as though reading my thoughts. "That is Dr. Mallory. He has, been under much stress lately?" I nodded, though my eyes remained fixed on Mallory. His demeanor was odd, his posture stiff, his movements unnatural. It was as if something was gnawing at him, some dark shadow lurking behind his calm exterior. As if sensing my gaze, Dr. Mallory turned and locked eyes with me for a brief moment. His lips parted as if to speak, but he hesitated, then simply nodded curtly before retreating further into the shadows of the room. "Strange," I muttered under my breath. "He's not himself tonight." Dr. Lambert's face darkened. "You have no idea, Poirot." Later that evening, the air in the hospital grew even heavier, as though the very walls were bearing witness to a secret too terrible to remain hidden. Dr. Lambert guided me to a private area, away from the crowd of surgeons, where I could not help but notice the deep concern etched on his face. "You see," he began in a lowered voice. "There has been an incident. Dr. Mallory performed a delicate operation this morning, one that should have been straightforward. Mr. Charles Everson, a wealthy businessman, was his patient." I raised an eyebrow, my curiosity piqued. "And what is the problem, then?" "The operation was a success," Dr. Lambert continued, "but the wrong surgery was performed. A mix-up of medical records, you see. Mallory was supposed to operate on a different man, a Mr. Harrison Blake, but instead Everson received the procedure meant for Blake." I froze, absorbing the gravity of the situation. A simple mistake, a slip of the hand in the heat of the moment, could spell disaster. And yet the way Dr. Lambert spoke made it sound as though this was not just an innocent error. "Has Dr. Mallory explained this mistake?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Not in so many words. He left the hospital abruptly this afternoon, without so much as a word to anyone. No one knows where he has gone." Dr. Lambert's voice lowered further. "It is as though he has disappeared entirely." I could sense the mounting tension in the room. The more I thought about the strange behavior of Dr. Mallory, the more I felt that there was something sinister at play. A mistake, yes, but why would Mallory flee in such a manner? What had driven him to leave behind everything, his reputation, his colleagues, his life? I could not shake the feeling that something more than a mere error was at the heart of this mystery. And then, just as I turned to speak with Dr. Lambert once more, I heard a sharp intake of breath from one of the nearby surgeons. "He's gone," the man whispered urgently, his face pale. "Everson. He was found in his bed this afternoon, dead." I turned to Dr. Lambert, who was now visibly shaken. His eyes widened with disbelief, and for the first time I saw fear, true, unadulterated fear, in his eyes. The mystery deepened. The night unfolded. I could not help but feel the tension growing thicker, like a thick fog surrounding us. My little grey cells began to work in overdrive, piecing together the strange, fragmented details. Why had Dr. Mallory fled? What had really happened in that operating room? And most importantly, what had driven a well-respected surgeon make such a grave mistake? I turned to Dr. Lambert one last time before the night ended. "I shall take a closer look at this case, my friend," I said, my voice calm but determined. "There is more to this than meets the eye, and I believe Dr. Mallory's strange actions are the key." As I left St. Augustine's Hospital that evening, my thoughts were consumed by the mystery that lay ahead. The surgeon who had operated on the wrong man had vanished, and now a man was dead. What was the truth behind Dr. Mallory's disappearance? And could it be connected to the untimely death of Mr. Everson? With every step I took away from the hospital, I could feel the walls of the mystery closing in around me. The game had begun. Chapter 2. The Unfortunate Death. The fog had returned to London, thick and unyielding, shrouding the streets in its ghostly embrace. It was only a few days after the disturbing events at St. Augustine's Hospital, and my mind had not yet fully escaped the grip of the mystery that had begun to unravel there. Dr. Mallory's strange behavior, the deadly mix-up in surgery, and the sudden death of Mr. Everson. All these events felt connected in a way I could not yet understand. When the call came, it was Dr. Lambert's voice on the other end, strained and anxious. "Poirot, you must come at once. It is Dr. Mallory. He's dead." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. "What has happened?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. "It appears he took his own life," Dr. Lambert continued, his voice faltering. "We found him in his study this morning. A suicide." I had expected as much. It was always the case in these kinds of matters. The suspect was often the victim in the end, a tragic conclusion that made sense only after the facts had been sifted through carefully. But something about the whole situation did not sit right with me. The circumstances were too neat, too convenient. "I will be there shortly," I replied, my voice steady, masking the unease I felt. When I arrived at St. Augustine's, the atmosphere was thick with the heavy weight of tragedy. The hospital, usually filled with the sounds of medical activity, was eerily quiet. The staff moved with a solemnity that could only come with the death of one of their own. The corridors were dimly lit, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch. Toward me, as I walked, Dr. Lambert was waiting for me at the entrance to Dr. Mallory's study. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with disbelief. "Poirot, I wish I could explain it all to you, but—" Dr. Lambert's voice trailed off. He seemed at a loss for words, a rare thing for him. I gave him a knowing look, offering no immediate words of comfort. My thoughts were already racing ahead, considering all possibilities. I followed him into the study, a room that seemed almost untouched by the tragedy that had taken place within it. It was a small, private office, cluttered with medical journals, papers, and several bookshelves filled with texts on surgical procedures and anatomy. Dr. Mallory's body had been found slumped in his chair by the desk, a small, unmarked revolver lying in his lap. A glass of untouched brandy sat on the desk beside him, the amber liquid glistening faintly in the low light. It appeared to be a scene of quiet resignation. And yet I could not shake the feeling that this was not the full picture. I stepped closer to the desk and immediately noticed the piece of paper beside the brandy glass, Dr. Mallory's suicide note. "It was all wrong," I muttered, my eyes scanning the handwritten words. The note read, "The wrong man. It was always the wrong man." I carefully picked up the paper and examined it under the dim light. The handwriting was slanted, hurried, yet precise in some strange way. It did not strike me as the writing of a man who had come to terms with his own death. There was an urgency in the words, as if the writer were trying to convey something far deeper than simple despair. "The wrong man," I whispered aloud, my thoughts swirling. What could he have meant? Was it the man on the operating table? Or perhaps someone else? I glanced at Dr. Lambert, who seemed to be holding himself together by the thinnest of threads. "What was his state before you found him?" I asked, my voice gentle but probing. "He had been distant," Dr. Lambert replied, struggling to find the right words. "For days now, ever since the incident with Mr. Everson. But this note," he stopped, unable to continue. "Is there anyone who could have seen him, spoken to him just before—" I trailed off, not wanting to finish the thought. "Dr. Armstrong?" Lambert said, a look of discomfort crossing his face. "He was here yesterday, just hours before we found Mallory's body. He was agitated, to say the least. I did not think much of it at the time, but now I wonder, Dr. Armstrong, I knew the name, a colleague of Mallory's, but not one with whom he had been particularly close. Armstrong had always seemed the type to harbour a quiet bitterness, too eager to criticize others, but never quite as competent as he liked to believe himself. Could he have been involved in some way? "You say he was agitated?" I asked, pressing Dr. Lambert for more details. He was in a hurry, and he seemed to be avoiding eye contact. He kept looking over his shoulder as though he feared being followed. And he did not stay long, just long enough to speak with Mallory about some medical matter. But Mallory, he did not seem like himself. He was distracted, off his usual game. I took in this new information, my mind carefully assessing the possibilities. Was Dr. Armstrong's agitation simply the result of his own professional anxieties, or was there more to it? Could he have had a hand in Mallory's death, whether by manipulation, coercion, or something more nefarious? As I stood there considering all these things, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Dr. Armstrong himself. He looked somewhat dishevelled, his face a study of ill-concealed nerves. "Dr. Lambert," he said, glancing past him at me. His eyes locked onto mine for just a moment before he cleared his throat. "Poirot, I presume?" I gave him a polite nod, though I did not trust the man's demeanour. There was something in his eyes, something fleeting that seemed to suggest guilt. "But I could not be sure yet, Dr. Armstrong," I said, my voice calm but inquisitive. "I was just hearing about your visit to Dr. Mallory yesterday. Perhaps you could tell me more about your conversation." His gaze flickered slightly, and I could see the discomfort in his posture. I only came to speak to Mallory about a technical matter," he stammered, his voice betraying his unease. There was a discrepancy in some of the notes regarding Mr. Everson's case. I thought it best to clarify things before anything went further. "And was the matter resolved?" I pressed, not allowing him to avoid my gaze. Armstrong hesitated, then nodded curtly. Yes, it was." His eyes darted away, and I noticed his hand tremble ever so slightly, a clear sign of anxiety. But was it fear of being caught in a lie, or fear of something far worse? I gave Dr. Armstrong a long, searching look before turning back to the note on Dr. Mallory's desk. It was the only clue I had, and I was determined to make sense of it. The wrong man, always the wrong man. These words would haunt me. There was something behind them, something important. Dr. Mallory had not ended his life because of a simple mistake. No, there was more at play here, and I would uncover it, no matter how many shadows I had to chase. As I turned to leave the study, I could feel the pressure of the mystery closing in tighter around me. I had yet to determine who was truly behind Dr. Mallory's tragic end, but I was certain of one thing. Someone was hiding something, and I would find out who before this case was through. With every step I took down the hall, my resolve solidified. I would not let this mystery slip away. The wrong man. There was truth in those words, and I would not rest until I had unravelled it. Chapter 3. Gathering the Evidence. The air in St. Augustine's Hospital felt thick, like the kind of silence that settles before a storm. The walls, lined with sterile white, seemed to close in on me as I walked through the corridors, each step a soft echo in the vast, empty hallways. I had just left Dr. Armstrong, whose answers had been less than convincing, and now I found myself back in the heart of the hospital. Dr. Lambert had been unusually quiet, but I could sense the undercurrent of his unease. He knew, just as I did, that there was far more to the situation than a mere suicide. Mallory's death was not a simple act of despair. No, it was a puzzle, one that needed to be solved, and it was time to begin searching for the pieces. I started with Dr. Lambert, who stood by the entrance to Mallory's office, his posture stiff. He had been a friend to Mallory, a colleague, and though he wore the mask of composure, I could see it in his eyes, the fear, the dread of what might be uncovered. "Dr. Lambert," I began, my voice calm but insistent, "tell me more about the surgery, the one that went wrong. You've mentioned it before, but I need every detail. There's something about it that doesn't add up." He shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twitching at his side, but he complied, though reluctantly. "It was a complicated case, Mr. Everson's surgery. It was supposed to be routine, but—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. It was as though the words themselves were too heavy to bear. "Ah," I said, pressing forward. I see. But you mentioned complications, yes? Could you elaborate? Dr. Lambert exhaled slowly, clearly struggling to keep his composure. There were discrepancies in the reports. Mallory was certain it had gone well at first, but the patient's condition worsened overnight. The team disagreed on the course of action and... His voice faltered again and he cleared his throat. There were different opinions. Mr. Everson's recovery was far slower than expected. And when he was conscious, he kept saying things that didn't make sense. Such as, I asked, leaning in slightly. He spoke of voices. He claimed to have seen things, visions, hallucinations, but no one could understand what he meant. It wasn't like him. He'd been perfectly healthy before. It was unsettling. I let that thought linger for a moment. What had Mr. Everson seen? Was it possible that something had gone terribly wrong during the surgery? And if so, could Dr. Mallory have been hiding it? Or was there something even darker at play? Tell me about the other patients, I pressed. Were there any others who had unusual reactions? Anything out of the ordinary? Dr. Lambert's gaze shifted toward the hallway, as though he feared someone might overhear us. There were several. But Mr. Everson, he was the one who seemed most affected. His condition became the focal point. Others, they didn't seem to notice anything amiss. But I'm not so sure. I nodded, taking in his words. There was something he wasn't saying, something he was withholding. I could see it in the way he hesitated before answering, the subtle way he looked away when a question struck too close to the truth. But I also knew that pushing him too hard might close the door to further cooperation. The tension in the hospital was palpable. There was a fear that ran deeper than the usual medical concerns. It was a fear of something darker, something that no one dared acknowledge. Let us go speak with the staff, I said, changing tactics. Perhaps they can shed some light on this matter. We made our way through the hospital, stopping to speak with the nurses and doctors who had worked under Dr. Mallory's direction. At first, they were polite, even cooperative. But the more questions I asked, the more I noticed the subtle signs of discomfort. Fidgeting hands, averted eyes, and the carefully worded answers that seemed to dodge the heart of the issue. Nurse Timmins, for instance, had been present during the surgery, yet when I asked her about the complications, she became visibly flustered. It was just a bad case, you know, she said, her voice rising slightly. Dr. Mallory did his best, but sometimes these things happen. Her answer was far too simplistic, far too rehearsed. It didn't feel genuine. Bad cases do happen. Nurse Timmins, I said, my voice soft but insistent. But in this case, something feels off, doesn't it? The complications, Mr. Everson's strange remarks, there's more here than just a bad case, don't you agree? She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door. I don't know what you mean, she stammered, taking a step back. I should get back to my duties, Monsieur Poirot. I could see that she was hiding something, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. But I also knew that pressing her too hard would only close her off completely. Instead, I gave her a polite smile, promising I'd speak to her again later. I could see the relief on her face as I turned to leave. Dr. Lambert, too, seemed uneasy with the line of questioning. I've told you what I know, Poirot, he said, his voice tight. What are you getting at? I am not yet certain, I replied, but I sense that the staff here knows more than they are letting on. There is fear in their eyes, fear of something far worse than a botched surgery. As we continued our interviews, the mood in the hospital grew heavier. It was as though the walls themselves were whispering secrets, their silence filled with things unsaid. The more I questioned the staff, the more I began to realize that they were all hiding something, a deep, underlying dread that connected them all to Mallory's death. By the time I reached the end of the hallway, I had learned little more than I already knew. The staff's behavior had only confirmed what I had suspected from the beginning. Something sinister was at play here. A secret, buried deep within the hospital, was waiting to be uncovered. And Dr. Mallory's death, far from being a simple suicide, was a key to unlocking that mystery. I had one last stop to make before leaving, the room where Mr. Everson was recovering. If anyone could shed light on Mallory's final days, it was the patient who had suffered the most as I approached. The door, I felt a strange chill run down my spine. Whatever the truth was, I knew I was getting closer to it. But there was something waiting for me. Something that would make this investigation far more dangerous than I had anticipated. I pushed open the door, and the room inside seemed to hold its breath. Chapter 4. The Victim's Past. The room was dim, and as the door swung open, I was met with the faint scent of antiseptic and the soft murmur of hospital equipment. Mr. Everson lay in his bed, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes half-lidded as though the weight of something far heavier than mere physical exhaustion burdened him. He looked up as I entered, but the recognition in his gaze was fleeting. He didn't speak immediately, his expression lost in the haze of whatever was occupying his mind. I drew a chair beside his bed, settling myself with my usual methodical precision. "Monsieur Everson," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I must ask you some questions. I believe you may hold the key to understanding what happened to Dr. Mallory. It is very important that you speak plainly." The patient blinked, trying to gather himself, his hand twitching towards the sheet that covered him. "Dr. Mallory." His voice was weak, almost a whisper, but there was an undeniable tremor in it. He wasn't himself, Monsieur Poirot." I leaned forward slightly, intrigued. In what way was he not himself? Everson's eyes flitted nervously around the room before locking onto mine. He was distant. After the surgery, he didn't act like the man I'd known. At first, he seemed sure, confident. But then, after I came to, he was different. Like he knew something but didn't want to tell me. His breath hitched. "And the voices, Monsieur Poirot, I kept hearing them." "Voices?" I repeated, my mind racing. "What kind of voices?" He shook his head slowly, as though even the memory of them was too much to bear. "I don't know. They were whispers, almost like they were coming from the walls or the floor, but they were always in my head, telling me things, warnings." "Warnings?" I pressed. "Of what?" But Everson fell silent, his eyes glazing over. It was clear that he wasn't ready or able to share more. His hands gripped the sheets tightly, and his breathing became more labored, as if the act of recalling the details had worn him down further. I knew then that this was not a man at peace with his own mind. Something was deeply amiss, and whatever it was entwined with Mallory's fate. I left him in the room, unsure if he could offer me anything more at that moment. The hallway felt colder as I stepped back into it, my thoughts swirling. I was no closer to understanding the full scope of the tragedy that had unfolded, but the voices Everson described were chilling. Were they the result of a medical complication or something far more sinister? It seemed unlikely that Mallory's involvement in Everson's surgery was purely coincidental, especially when coupled with the rumors of malpractice that had shadowed his career. I needed more information, something that could offer a clearer picture of the surgeon's life. Dr. Mallory's past, perhaps, might hold the key to unraveling this web of mystery. Returning to my hotel room, I made a series of calls. I spoke with a few colleagues from the police force, requesting access to Mallory's financial records and any previous allegations of medical negligence that might have followed him throughout his career. The information I received was troubling. To say the least, Dr. Mallory's name was indeed associated with a string of incidents some years ago involving accusations of botched surgeries and patients who had suffered severe complications. However, none of these had led to criminal charges. Most had been quietly settled out of court, and the details had been kept under wraps, hidden behind layers of legal jargon. But what caught my attention was the stark contrast between the accusations and Mallory's meteoric rise to prominence in the medical world. How had such a man gone from disgrace to respectability? The answer, it seemed, was money, or rather a lack of it. A series of transactions had caught my eye. Large sums of money, each one transferred to Mallory's name from an anonymous source. The dates coincided with some of the most difficult periods in his life when his career was in jeopardy and his reputation was in tatters. These were not payments for medical services rendered, they were bribes, or at least they seemed to be. Someone had been keeping him afloat, offering financial support to ensure that he remained a respected member of the medical community. But the question that lingered in my mind was, who had provided this assistance? And more importantly, why I needed to follow the money further, but that would require more time than I had at my disposal. Instead, I turned to a more personal avenue. Dr. Mallory had been known to have had several relationships, but one in particular stood out: Sophie Devereux, a former lover of his. According to my sources, their relationship had been tumultuous, marked by jealousy, lies, and a growing bitterness that had led to a bitter breakup just before Mallory's career took a dramatic turn for the better. I arranged to meet Sophie at a small cafe just outside the hospital grounds. She had agreed to speak with me, though I could sense from the brief conversation over the phone that she was not eager to delve into the past. Nevertheless, I had learned over the years that even the most reluctant of witnesses had a way of revealing truths when pressed with the right questions. When I arrived at the cafe, Sophie was already there, sitting in a corner booth, her eyes scanning the room. She was a striking woman with sharp features and an air of grace that had likely charmed Mallory during their brief time together. But beneath that polished exterior, I sensed a certain wariness in her demeanor, as though she was constantly on guard. "Mademoiselle Devereux," I said, taking a seat across from her, "I appreciate you agreeing to meet with me." She smiled politely, but the tension in her posture was undeniable. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. I only hope you're not here to dredge up old memories." "I am here to seek the truth," I replied, watching her closely. "I am investigating the death of Dr. Mallory, and I believe you may have information that could help." At the mention of Mallory's name, Sophie's face tightened. She took a long sip of her coffee, her fingers gripping the cup tightly, as if trying to control the emotion swirling within her. "I've told the police everything I know," she said stiffly. "Ah, yes," I said, leaning forward slightly. "But sometimes, mademoiselle, people leave out certain details when they speak with the police, things that they may not realize are important." She glanced up at me, her eyes narrowing. "And what exactly do you think I might know?" I paused for a moment, choosing my words carefully. "You were close to Dr. Mallory. You know him better than most. Were there any financial issues between you two? Did he ever seem under pressure?" Sophie's eyes flickered with something, surprise, perhaps, or guilt. She set the coffee cup down with deliberate slowness. "What are you implying, Monsieur Poirot? That I was somehow involved in his fall from grace?" I shook my head, my tone soft but persistent. I am not implying anything, mademoiselle. I am simply trying to understand why Dr. Mallory was driven to a position where he might have been forced to accept money from questionable sources. You see, I believe someone may have been blackmailing him, and I need to understand who had the power to do so. Sophie's expression remained unreadable, but her lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know anything about blackmail," she said quickly. "But you're right about one thing. He was under pressure. And I know who he was afraid of. He was afraid of a man from his past, a man who could destroy everything he'd worked for." "Who was this man?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She hesitated, the words seemingly trapped in her throat. Then, with a final glance around the cafe, she leaned forward. "You need to look into Victor Marlowe, that's all I'll say." Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog, the name echoing in my mind. Victor Marlowe, another piece of the puzzle, another name that would surely lead to more secrets. As I left the cafe, the feeling of being close to the truth gnawed at me, but the path forward was still obscured. There were more layers to peel back, more mysteries to uncover, and Sophie Devereux had just given me the next clue. Chapter 5. The Key. Witness, I arrived at the hospital the following morning, my thoughts still lingering on Sophie Devereux's cryptic warning. Victor Marlowe, a name that now held the promise of unravelling the final threads of this twisted case. But for now there was another matter at hand, Mr. Everson. His case was peculiar, to say the least. A man who had nearly died under Dr. Mallory's hands, yet his demeanour had been unsettlingly calm during our previous exchange. Most people in his situation would have been consumed with rage or fear. But Mr. Everson, well, he was different. Too calm, too measured. His tranquil composure seemed almost practiced, as if he was deliberately controlling the emotions that should have naturally surfaced in a man who had come so close to death. I approached his room, but as I stood outside the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. Was Everson simply a victim of circumstance, or was he perhaps complicit in something darker? I would know soon enough. The door creaked softly as I entered, and I found Everson sitting up in his bed, reading a newspaper with an air of indifference. His eyes flickered up when I entered, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of something in them. Was it recognition? Guilt? He quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice even. "I was expecting you." "You are most perceptive, Monsieur Everson," I replied, taking a seat by his bedside. "I trust you are feeling well after the surgery?" He gave a small nod, but there was something in his gaze that seemed distant. "Well enough, I suppose," he said, his voice not matching the gravity of his words. There was an underlying calm in his tone that felt out of place. "Good," I said, leaning in slightly as I examined him carefully. "I must ask you to recall more of what happened after the surgery. You mentioned voices. These voices, Monsieur Everson, what exactly were they?" Everson shifted slightly, avoiding my gaze. "I'm afraid I don't remember much clearly," he said softly. "The anesthesia, it muddled my thoughts. I was disoriented for days, but—" He hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. "There were times when I thought I heard something. Someone speaking, giving me warnings." "Warnings?" I asked, my voice low and precise. "What kind of warnings?" He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "I don't know. It's hard to explain. I could hear them, but they never made sense. A voice that wasn't there, saying things like, 'Stay quiet,' or 'Don't trust him.' But I was too weak, too confused to make sense of it all. I studied him carefully. His response was vague, but there was something about the way he phrased it that made me uneasy. It was as if he was skirting around something deeper, something important. Before I could press further, Everson's phone rang, slicing through the silence of the room. He reached for it absently, his calmness unbroken. "Excuse me," he muttered, picking up the phone. I waited in silence, observing him intently. There was an odd stillness to his every movement, as if he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. The phone conversation was brief, but I could make out a few disjointed phrases. Everson's voice dropped lower, and he spoke in a tone that was strangely formal, almost as if he were conducting business rather than having a casual conversation. "I understand," Everson said quietly. "The meeting is scheduled for tomorrow. I'll be there as planned." "Yes, of course. Thank you." Twixt. Phone clicked shut, and he placed it on the table beside him. His eyes met mine again, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a fleeting nervousness that vanished almost immediately, replaced by his usual calm. "Monsieur Everson," I said, my voice steady. "Who was that on the phone? It seemed rather urgent." Everson's eyes flickered, but he quickly regained his composure. "Just a colleague of mine. Someone who's helping me with the legalities surrounding my surgery," he said nonchalantly. "Legalities?" I repeated, my interest piqued. "What do you mean by that?" He leaned back against his pillows, as though the weight of the conversation was becoming too much for him to bear. "There's been talk of malpractice. A few people want to press charges against Dr. Mallory for what happened to me. This man, he's been handling all the details, arranging meetings, you know. I'm just trying to get this all settled as quickly as possible." I studied Everson closely, my mind racing. "A malpractice case," he said. But why was he so calm about it? Most victims in his position would have been consumed with fear or anger, but Everson seemed almost detached. Was it guilt? Or perhaps there was more to this story than a mere botched surgery? I decided to push further. "And this man, who is he? What is his name?" Everson hesitated for a moment, then gave a small shrug. "I don't know much about him. He's just a lawyer, I suppose. He keeps his identity under wraps, but he's been working on my case for months now." A lawyer with a hidden identity. This was no ordinary malpractice case. Something about it felt wrong. The way Everson spoke, as if the details of his involvement didn't matter, was too casual, too rehearsed. He was hiding something, but what? "I see," I said slowly, tapping my fingers lightly on the arm of my chair. "And when is this meeting you mentioned? The one with the colleague?" Everson's lips tightened, but he forced a smile. "Tomorrow afternoon. I'm sure it'll be just a formality. Nothing to worry about." A formality, the word echoed in my mind, and I wondered if it was a slip of the tongue or a deliberate attempt to downplay the significance of the meeting. In any case, I now had a new lead to pursue. Whoever this mysterious lawyer was, he seemed to be at the heart of something much larger than a simple malpractice case. As I prepared to leave, I could feel the weight of the conversation settling in my chest. There was so much left unsaid, and yet Mr. Everson seemed eager to cooperate. His calmness, however, felt more like a mask, one that he wore to hide a deeper anxiety. Before I could speak again, Everson's voice stopped me. "Monsieur Poirot," he said softly, his voice carrying an edge of vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "I must tell you, I'm not sure I can trust everyone involved in this case. There are things I'm not telling you, things that could change everything." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. And just as quickly as he had shown his moment of weakness, He closed off again, retreating behind his facade of calm. "I'll see you tomorrow, Monsieur Poirot," he said, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. As I left the room, my thoughts swirled in confusion. What had Everson meant by his cryptic words? What was he hiding? And why had he seemed so calm about everything, despite the life-altering events he had just endured? One thing was clear. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. But there were many more layers to uncover before the truth would reveal itself. Chapter 6. A surprising confession. I arrived at Dr. Armstrong's office with a distinct sense of foreboding. The doctor's behavior in the past few days had been erratic at best. His public confidence had begun to crumble, revealing an underlying panic. The subtle shifts in his composure, the quick darting glances, the nervous adjustments of his collar spoke volumes. A man on the edge, struggling to keep control over something that threatened to overwhelm him. When I entered his office, I found him pacing back and forth, as if unable to settle his restless energy. He stopped abruptly when he saw me, his hands still trembling from the last step of his frenetic motion. The faint glint of sweat on his brow, despite the cool air of the room, suggested a deeper anxiety than he was willing to admit. "Monsieur Poirot," he greeted me, his voice not quite steady, but still laced with an artificial calm. "You're here. I suppose you have come for the truth?" I regarded him silently for a moment. There was an air of deflection in his posture, as though he were trying to guard against something, perhaps even himself. I took a seat across from him, observing his every movement, every twitch in his otherwise composed facade. "The truth, Dr. Armstrong, is an elusive thing," I said, allowing my words to settle between us. "But you, perhaps, hold more of it than you might be willing to admit." Dr. Armstrong's eyes darted to the window, avoiding my gaze. His fingers clasped and unclasped nervously in his lap, the subtle gesture betraying his internal turmoil. "You're mistaken, Poirot," he replied, the words coming out in a low, almost whispered tone. "I have nothing to hide." "Oh, then perhaps you could explain why I found evidence that you, Monsieur Armstrong, tampered with medical records," I said, allowing the weight of my words to fill the room. "Records relating to a certain incident in the past that never quite made it into the public eye. It seems Dr. Mallory was not the first to be involved in such a situation." For a moment, Armstrong stood perfectly still, the colour draining from his face. His lips parted as though to speak, but no sound came out. Then, with a heavy sigh, he sat down at his desk, slumping into his chair as though the weight of the world had suddenly descended upon him. "Damn it!" he muttered under his breath. "You don't miss a thing, do you, Poirot?" "I do not make it my business to miss things, monsieur," I replied calmly, watching his expression closely. "Now please, tell me what happened. Why were the records altered? What was it that you were trying to cover up?" Armstrong ran a hand over his face, his eyes looking distant. "It was a mistake," he said slowly, his voice heavy with the burden of guilt. "One of Mallory's earlier surgeries, there was a complication, a very serious one. The patient was a woman, a young woman. She almost died. Mallory had already been through so much by then, and He trailed off, his gaze fixed on the papers in front of him, his fingers twitching as he moved them around nervously. I leaned forward, my curiosity piqued. "And you covered it up?" I asked, the question hanging in the air. Armstrong met my gaze then, his eyes dark with shame. "I didn't know what else to do. Mallory was, well, he was a genius, but he wasn't a saint. He made mistakes, but no one could know. If the hospital found out, it would have ruined him. Ruined us both. His words were heavy, laden with the kind of guilt that only a person who had gone too far to turn back could carry. It was a confession, though not a complete one. He had offered just enough to raise further questions without quite answering any of them. "Go on," I encouraged, my voice soothing but firm. "You covered up this mistake, but what about Mallory's death? Where do you fit into that?" Armstrong's expression shifted, his eyes hardening, but his lips trembled. "I had nothing to do with his death, I swear it!" He slammed his fist against the desk, as though the very accusation stung him. "You think I would kill him, after all we've been through?" "No, Poirot. Mallory was about to destroy us all, not just me. He was going to expose everything." "Expose what?" I pressed, leaning forward, my voice intense. "What exactly was Mallory going to reveal?" Armstrong's face contorted with anger, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "He knew too much," he spat, his voice rising with emotion. "He was going to take down the entire system, expose the truth about the malpractice, about the money we've all been hiding behind closed doors. And he was going to use me as the scapegoat. He was going to ruin me, Poirot." I studied Armstrong carefully. His emotions were a tangle of anger, fear, and guilt, each one so raw it was almost palpable in the room. But there was something in his words that didn't quite sit right. The idea that Mallory had been poised to expose everything? Could it be true, or was it a convenient excuse? "You are suggesting that Mallory's death was a result of his own desire for vengeance?" I asked, my voice filled with measured skepticism. Armstrong's gaze flickered momentarily, and I saw a crack in his conviction. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice lowering. "I don't know what happened." To him, Poirot, I only know that he had become dangerous. He was unstable. He wasn't the same man I once worked with. "So you are saying that Mallory's intent to destroy you, destroy all of you, was the cause of his own demise?" I asked, my tone still calm, but my mind already turning over the possibilities. "I don't know, Poirot," Armstrong said again, his voice tinged with desperation. "I swear to you I never wanted him dead. I just wanted to protect myself, to keep my life intact." I studied him for a long moment, allowing the silence to stretch between us. There was more here, more that he wasn't telling me. The conflict, in his eyes, the cracks in his composure, all pointed to a man caught between guilt and fear. He was lying, but not about everything. I was certain of it. "You are telling me a story, Dr. Armstrong," I said slowly, my voice cutting through the tension. "But your story is incomplete. You speak of Mallory's threat to expose you, but you also speak of guilt, of fear. It seems to me that you were as much a victim as you were a participant." He looked at me then, his face a mixture of frustration and resignation. "I didn't want any of this," he said, his voice trembling. "But now I fear it's too late." "And what of the phone call you received the night Mallory was murdered?" I asked, watching for his reaction. "Was that another part of your cover-up, or were you being coerced?" Armstrong flinched at the question, his eyes widening in sudden alarm. "What phone call?" he stammered, his hand shaking. I don't know what you mean." I leaned back, watching him closely. There was something in his response that had changed. The guilt, the anger, the fear, it was all shifting now, and I had no doubt that this conversation was far from over. Chapter 7: The Surgical Mistake. I left Dr. Armstrong's office with a lingering unease. His words, while revealing a significant amount of guilt, also left behind a sense of ambiguity. There was no clear-cut confession, no finality in his admission of guilt. His fears, his anger, and his guilt seemed to have tangled together into a knot too complex for him to untie. What was he hiding, and how much of it was true? The next step in my investigation seemed clear. The surgical mistake that had nearly cost Mr. Everson his life, the records, the inconsistencies, all of it pointed back to the hospital. Dr. Mallory's involvement, the hidden pressures, and the strange atmosphere in that operating room. Something was off, and it was time I had a closer look. I made my way to the hospital the following morning, an unsettling tension accompanying each step I took through the sterile corridors. I had already questioned the key players involved in Mr. Everson's surgery, but now I needed to examine the place where it all happened, the operating room itself, the heart of the mystery. The hospital staff, though polite, seemed to grow uneasy as I made my way to the records room. The clattering of keyboards and the rustling of papers abruptly quieted when I entered, as if my presence had unnerved them. I paid no attention to their stares. My focus was singular, the truth I sought hidden somewhere in those files. As I flipped through the medical records, I was struck by the meticulousness of it all. Every detail was accounted for, every procedure and medication logged with precision. But then, in the middle of Mr. Everson's surgery records, I found it, the inconsistency that had eluded the initial investigation. There, buried under a seemingly unrelated entry, was another patient's file. A name I did not recognize, but the details were unmistakable. It was a surgery performed the day before Mr. Everson's. The documents were inserted by mistake, or so it seemed at first. The discrepancy was small but significant. The mix-up had occurred in the timing of certain procedures, details of anesthesia administration. These were not the kinds of mistakes that simply happened, not when lives were at stake. I muttered to myself, examining the records closely. Was this a mistake or sabotage? It didn't seem like a simple error, especially considering the timing of the mix-up and the circumstances surrounding the surgery. Something didn't add up. I made a note of the patient's name from the other file and proceeded to ask around the hospital. It wasn't long before I found Nurse Hawkins, the woman who had been present during Mr. Everson's surgery. She was pacing nervously into the hallway when I approached her. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," she said, with a tight smile, though there was no mistaking the tension in her voice. "What can I help you with today?" "Nurse Hawkins, I am revisiting the events of Mr. Everson's surgery. I need to ask you about something you may have seen on the night in question." She stiffened at the mention of the surgery, her eyes flicking nervously toward the door. "I don't know if I can be of much help, monsieur. It's all a bit confusing." "I understand," I replied, offering a reassuring smile. "But there is something I must know. It has come to my attention that Dr. Mallory was seen in the hospital late that night, after his shift had ended. Can you confirm this?" Nurse Hawkins hesitated. She looked as if she were wrestling with something inside herself, her hands wringing the fabric of her uniform. Finally, she spoke in a low voice, her words laced with fear. "Yes, I saw him," she said, almost too quietly for me to hear. "Dr. Mallory was in the hospital after hours. He was in the operating room acting strange." "Strange?" I echoed, leaning in slightly. "What do you mean by strange?" Her face flushed, and she quickly looked around, as though she feared someone might overhear. "He was talking to himself, muttering about something. I didn't understand it, but he was clearly upset. I think he was worried about something, about the surgery, about the mix-up. I don't know, but there was a lot of fear in his voice." "And you are certain it was Mallory?" I pressed. "Yes, monsieur. she said, nodding vigorously. I'm sure of it. But, she bit her lip, glancing over her shoulder nervously. I didn't see him for long, and I didn't want to get involved. People have been talking. It's best not to stir up things. People are scared of Dr. Mallory, you know. I felt a wave of sympathy for her. The fear in her eyes was genuine, the kind of fear one feels when in the presence of someone who commands power without restraint. Dr. Mallory's reputation had cast a long shadow over this place, and Nurse Hawkins, it seemed, had no desire to be caught up in anything that might bring retaliation down upon her. I understand, Nurse Hawkins, I said, my tone softening. But I must ask, did you ever report what you saw to anyone? To the authorities, perhaps? Her eyes widened in panic, and she quickly shook her head. No, I didn't. I couldn't. I don't want to be involved in any of this. You don't understand what it's like here. People disappear, careers vanish. I didn't want to risk it. Her words were heavy with the weight of truth, though they left me with more questions than answers. Why had Dr. Mallory been in the hospital late that night? And what had he been afraid of? A surgical mistake was one thing, but fear was a much deeper motivator. Could his erratic behavior that night have been related to the mix-up I had just discovered? As I was about to continue my questioning, Nurse Hawkins's demeanour shifted. Her face went pale, and she glanced over my shoulder, eyes darting nervously. I can't talk about this anymore, she stammered, her voice trembling. It's too dangerous. Before I could stop her, she turned and rushed down the corridor, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there for a moment, mulling over the conversation. Something was terribly wrong here, but what exactly? I returned to the operating room to examine the documents once more, piecing together the subtle inconsistencies. Mallory's presence in the hospital after hours, the mix-up in Mr. Everson's surgery records, and the nurse's hesitant confession. Was it all connected? Or had I stumbled upon something unrelated, a series of coincidences? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of uncovering something far darker than a simple surgical mistake. Just as I was about to leave the room, a voice called out from the doorway. It was Nurse Hawkins again, standing in the entrance, her face pale. With fear. I was wrong, she whispered urgently. I was wrong about everything. There's something you need to know. I was too afraid before, but now I have to tell you. Dr. Mallory wasn't alone that night. I froze, my mind racing with possibilities. What could this new revelation mean? Chapter 8. Hidden motives. I had only just begun to process the implications of Nurse Hawkins's sudden confession when the sound of her retreating footsteps grew fainter, swallowed by the labyrinthine halls of the hospital. Her words echoed in my mind, vibrating with the weight of mystery. Dr. Mallory wasn't alone that night. Alone with what, exactly? And who could have been with him? A colleague? A patient? The possibilities seemed endless, but I knew one thing for certain. This was no coincidence. With my mind still racing, I decided to pivot my focus. There was another figure in this tangled web whose actions had begun to grow suspicious. Dr. Lambert. The tension between him and Dr. Mallory had been undeniable, and if there was anything Poirot had learned in his years of experience, it was that rivalry, especially in the world of medicine, could foster motives more dangerous than simple professional disagreements. Dr. Lambert had long been a respected surgeon, but there was an air of something darker about him, a kind of obsession with recognition that had been evident from the moment I met him. The competition between Lambert and Mallory had been fierce, and I had overheard enough whispers to know that their relationship was far from amicable. Mallory's success had only magnified Lambert's own insecurities, and I was beginning to See how far that envy might have driven him? I wasted no time in scheduling a meeting with Dr. Lambert, who had been uncharacteristically reserved since the incident with Mr. Everson. He was scheduled to be in the hospital later that afternoon, and I knew that I would need to tread carefully. The last thing I wanted was for him to feel cornered or defensive, but this was too important. The meeting took place in his office, a sterile, clinical space adorned with certificates and accolades that seemed to mock the man's inner conflict. Dr. Lambert sat behind his desk, his fingers drumming nervously on the wood. His face, while calm on the surface, betrayed a faint twitch in his jaw. It was as though the man was holding something back, something he didn't want to share. "Monsieur Poirot, it's good to see you again," he said, though his tone was stiff, almost guarded. "Indeed, Doctor," I replied, taking a seat across from him. "I trust you are well?" "Quite," he said, though his words seemed rehearsed. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "What can I do for you today, Poirot?" "I trust it is not more questions about Mr. Everson's unfortunate incident." I smiled faintly. "Ah, you are perceptive, Dr. Lambert. Yes, it is Mr. Everson that brings me here once again, though not in the way you might think. You see, I've been investigating the circumstances surrounding the surgery, and I've uncovered some details that are intriguing, to say the least." Lambert's posture stiffened, and his fingers ceased their drumming on the desk. "I don't understand, Poirot. What are you suggesting?" "I am not suggesting, Doctor. I am asking," I replied calmly. "You see, Dr. Mallory and you have been at odds for some time now, have you not? It has come to my attention that there was a disagreement between you and Mallory regarding a revolutionary surgical technique he patented, a technique that you, I believe, disputed." Lambert's face tightened, a flicker of discomfort flashing across his features before he regained his composure. "I fail to see how this is relevant to Mr. Everson's case," he said, his voice barely concealing the edge of irritation. "Ah, but it is relevant, mon ami," I countered. "A professional rivalry, a dispute over medical technique, all points towards something deeper. A hidden motive, perhaps, and when such motives lie beneath the surface, they often lead to regrettable consequences." I could see the man struggling to maintain his composure, his eyes darting to the stack of papers on his desk, as though seeking something to ground him. But in that moment, I knew he was unraveling inside, his tightly controlled facade beginning to crack. "There was no rivalry," Lambert muttered, his voice low. "Mallory was a brilliant surgeon, yes, but he was reckless. His techniques, his approach, they were unorthodox. Dangerous, even. I simply couldn't endorse them. I never agreed with the way he practiced." I leaned forward, my gaze intense. "And yet you did not hesitate to challenge him, did you? You questioned his methods publicly, even when you knew it could ruin his career. Why, Doctor? Was it the surgery techniques themselves or something more personal?" For a brief moment I saw the flicker of something I had expected. Resentment. Lambert's hands balled into fists, his knuckles white against the desk. His lips pressed together tightly, as though trying to swallow down a wave of emotion. "I wanted recognition," he confessed, his voice strained. "I worked my entire career for it. But Mallory, he had the charisma, the following. He patented techniques that the world was eager to adopt, and I was left behind. It was humiliating, Poirot. I was better than him. Everyone knew it. But Mallory, he had the right people in his corner. He had the power. I couldn't stand it." The bitterness in his voice was palpable, his obsession with recognition, his jealousy of Mallory's success. It was all too clear now. But that obsession, that bitter jealousy, it was not the end of the story. There was something more, something darker still. "Tell me, Doctor," I pressed, my voice unwavering. "What do you know of Mallory's behavior on the night Of the surgery? The night before, specifically? Lambert's eyes flickered, a sudden unease creeping into his expression. I don't know. I wasn't there. I had no reason to be. But you knew Mallory was upset, I continued, about the surgery mix-up, about the patients. You knew that Mallory had been in the hospital after hours. Was it possible that your rivalry had escalated, that his failure, his mistake, could that have driven you both to something far more dangerous than simply professional rivalry? Lambert's jaw clenched, and for a moment I wondered if he would lash out. But instead, he sat in silence, his gaze locked on mine, the weight of his thoughts hanging in the air between us. I have nothing to say to that, he muttered, shaking his head. Nothing at all. It was clear to me now. Dr. Lambert's jealousy of Mallory had consumed him, clouded his judgment, and perhaps driven him to actions that went beyond mere rivalry. But what had happened between them that night? What had transpired in those late hours that would push one surgeon to betray the other so completely? I rose from my seat, offering Lambert a final glance. Thank you for your time, Doctor. I shall leave you to your work for now. As I turned to leave, I could sense the deepening complexity of this case. The more I uncovered, the more it seemed that the rivalry between Mallory and Lambert was not the only force at play here. Something far more sinister was simmering beneath the surface. Dr. Lambert's motives were clouded, his anger evident. But what of Mallory? Could it be that the doctor had more than just professional envy to account for? I could feel the pieces of the puzzle coming together slowly, but as always, Poirot knew there was more yet to reveal. Chapter 9. A dangerous game. The quiet hum of the hospital seemed to hang in the air like an unspoken tension as I made my way through the corridors. The usual sterile scent of antiseptic mingled with the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee from the staff lounge. Yet something felt distinctly different today. The conversations I overheard in passing seemed more guarded, the hurried footsteps more frantic. The murder of Dr. Mallory had left its shadow over the entire establishment, and the atmosphere was thick with suspicion. It was this sense of unease that drew me back to the hospital, for I had a strong feeling that the truth was close at hand, but it was still shrouded in mystery. There were too many inconsistencies, too many half-finished stories, and most notably, too many people with something to hide. My interactions with Dr. Lambert had revealed an undercurrent of jealousy, but I knew this was not enough to explain the full scope of Mallory's death. I needed more. As I entered the small staff room, I noticed two surgeons engaged in a heated conversation by the coffee machine. Their voices were low, but not low enough to escape Poirot's keen ear. That mistake, one of them, Dr. Wallace, I recognized, was saying, it was the kind of thing that could have been fixed if someone had just caught it in time. Mallory wouldn't have let it happen if he had been focused, but he wasn't. He was distracted, and we all saw it. A fatal error. His companion, Dr. Quinn, nodded, his face contorted in concern. We all knew Mallory wasn't himself for the past few weeks, but the wrong man in the wrong place. It was worse than a mistake, Wallace. It was intentional, and you know it. I moved closer, careful not to make a sound, for their words were like pieces of a puzzle that had yet to be fit together. What do you mean, the wrong man? Dr. Wallace asked, his voice barely audible now. Dr. Quinn lowered his voice even further. The wrong man was involved in more than just a botched surgery. It was a cover-up, a way to get rid of him. I'm telling you, this wasn't just a mistake, it was a murder. Poirot's heart quickened at the mention of the word murder. I had suspected it, of course, but hearing it spoken aloud added a new layer of intrigue. Was Mallory's death really a carefully orchestrated act, designed to silence him for good? The implications were chilling. I had thought that Mallory's suicide was the most likely explanation, given the pressure surrounding him, but now there was something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface. Before I could piece together this new thread of information, a sharp voice broke my concentration. "Poirot, what are you doing lurking around here?" I turned quickly to find Dr. Hawkins, the anesthesiologist, standing in the doorway with an expression of mild irritation. His eyes darted back and forth between me and the two surgeons, his posture stiff, almost defensive. There was something about his demeanor that struck me as odd. A nervous energy hung around him, and I could sense that something was not quite right. "Ah, Dr. Hawkins," I said, smiling in what I hoped was a disarming manner. "I was merely enjoying the conversation, but it seems I have overstayed my welcome." Hawkins's gaze flickered for a moment, then he nodded curtly. "Well, we have work to do. Best not to be distracted by idle chatter." Of course, I agreed, though the oddness of his reaction lingered in my mind. It was almost as if he had something to hide, a reluctance to engage in any further discussion. I had seen his type before, someone hiding behind a veneer of professionalism, but beneath that, a nervousness that only came from guilt. The conversation between the two surgeons had ended abruptly as Hawkins's interruption shattered the tension. But I could see in their eyes, particularly in Dr. Quin's, that the seeds of doubt had been planted. They were unwilling to speak freely in front of Hawkins, that much was certain. But what had they meant by the wrong man? Who exactly had been the wrong man, and how deep did this conspiracy go? I turned back to Hawkins, who had already begun to walk away, and felt a strong urge to follow him. It was as if my instincts were warning me there was something off about him. His strange behavior around the time of Mallory's death, the way he seemed to avoid answering questions, and the way he had hurriedly dismissed me, all pointed toward one undeniable conclusion. Dr. Hawkins was hiding something. I decided to shadow him for a while. It was not an uncommon tactic for me, and I had always found that the truth could be uncovered in the smallest of moments, the unspoken gestures, the fleeting looks exchanged between individuals who believed themselves to be unnoticed. Hawkins led me through the hospital, his gait slightly quicker than usual, and I followed at a respectful distance. He moved in and out of various rooms, interacting with nurses and staff, but always in a clipped, businesslike manner. There was no time for pleasantries, no time for distractions. His focus was singular, and yet there was something almost mechanical about his movements. After a few minutes, I noticed that he had entered a small office at the far end of the corridor, one that I knew belonged to the head of anesthesiology. I paused outside, waiting for the door to close, then approached quietly. From my vantage point, I could see through the small window in the door that Hawkins was speaking to someone, though the figure was out of my line of sight. Their conversation seemed urgent, the words rapid and clipped. Hawkins's hands were clenched at his sides, and his face was flushed. I leaned in closer, but at that moment the door swung open and Hawkins stepped out, nearly colliding with me. He froze, his expression shifting from alarm to something more controlled, but the shift was too quick for me not to notice. "Poirot," he said, his voice strained, "you should really be getting back to your investigation. There's nothing to see here." But as he spoke, I could see the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, his eyes darting away from mine. It was the smallest of clues, yet it was enough to confirm my suspicion. Hawkins was more involved than he was letting on. I allowed my gaze to linger on him for a moment, my mind whirling. The conversation I had overheard in the staff room had added a new dimension to the case, but it also raised more questions. If Mallory's death had been orchestrated, who had orchestrated it? And what role had Hawkins played in it all? As Hawkins turned away, I took a step back, ensuring I was not seen, and began to formulate my next move. I needed more information, more concrete evidence to link Hawkins to Mallory's death. The pieces were slowly starting to come together, but I knew that the game was far from over. There were still many twists to be uncovered, and I had the sinking feeling that the deeper I dug, the darker the truth would become. Chapter 10. Dissecting the Alibis. The hours since my last encounter with Dr. Hawkins had only deepened the mystery, and I found myself back at the hospital the very next day, the air thick with the sense that I was nearing something momentous. The conversation in the staff room had left a bitter taste in my mouth. If Mallory's death had indeed been murder, then I was no longer dealing with a simple tragedy. There were far more layers, far more players involved in this game of deception. Someone was hiding something, someone in this very hospital, and I needed to expose them before the truth slipped away like sand through my fingers. The staff had all been questioned at length, but as I had discovered before, the truth was rarely so simple. Each person had an alibi, but in my experience, alibis could be the slipperiest of things, conveniently provided yet often full of holes. I had been listening carefully, observing, and now I needed to dig deeper into these stories, testing them with the same precision I would apply to a surgical incision. I started with Dr. Armstrong. A steady man by all outward appearances, his alibi for the night of Mallory's death was solid. He had been attending to a patient in surgery, one that had required his undivided attention for several hours, with witnesses who corroborated his presence. Yet there was something in his manner, a subtle shift in the way he answered questions, that had caught my attention. He seemed almost too composed, as though he were waiting for something, waiting for me to ask a particular question. I found him in his office, a place that had once been filled with the bustle of medical charts and files, now strangely quiet. As he turned to greet me, I couldn't help but feel that the polished veneer of professionalism he wore was a bit too perfect, too rehearsed. "Ah, Poirot," he said, his voice warm yet distant. "Back again, I see. Have you uncovered anything?"
"New? I have," I replied, folding my arms across my chest, studying him. "But I wonder, Dr. Armstrong, if you might be holding something back."
The flicker of surprise that passed across his face was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. He didn't answer immediately, instead walking over to his desk, his hands brushing over papers as though searching for something. "I assure you, there is nothing I can tell you that I haven't already. I've been nothing but forthcoming." "I do not doubt your words," I said, slowly. "However, I noticed something curious yesterday. A piece of equipment in your office, one that is supposed to have been lost."
"Years ago." His face went a shade paler, and he stilled for a moment. I'm not sure what you're referring to." "Ah, but I am," I replied, stepping closer. "A rare medical instrument, a diagnostic tool that was reportedly lost."
"In a fire several years ago, but I found it in your office, in plain sight." His eyes hardened, and I saw the faintest tremor in his hand as he picked up a file from the desk. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Poirot. That tool was a part of an older inventory. It was never truly lost. We simply never replaced it." "But it was not replaced," I said softly, the words dripping with implication. "It was hidden, and there is only one reason one would hide such a thing, to conceal its existence. Why would you keep something that had supposedly been destroyed?" Dr. Armstrong's gaze shifted, and for the first time I saw a crack in his calm demeanor.
"I don't know what you're implying," he said, his voice tight. I imply only the truth, I replied, my tone sharp.
Tell me, Dr. Armstrong, when did you last see Dr. Mallory? His eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought he might refuse to answer. But after a pause, he replied, his voice now more guarded. Several days ago, before his unfortunate death. We were colleagues, Poirot, but we didn't always see eye to eye. I raised an eyebrow. In what way? Mallory was... He trailed off, then sighed heavily. He was a genius, no doubt, but he had a way of stepping on others to get
ahead. He was always looking for the next big breakthrough, sometimes at the expense of his colleagues. I didn't always approve of his methods. So you disagreed on professional matters? I pressed. That's all? He said quickly,
shaking his head as though to dismiss the idea entirely. I don't know what you think you've uncovered here, Poirot, but it's not going to bring Mallory back. I studied him for a long moment, weighing his words. There was something he was not telling me, something that lay hidden beneath his words. But he wasn't the only one whose alibi had begun to fray at the edges. I moved on, questioning other staff members, but one by one their alibis held up under scrutiny. And yet there was an unease in the air. Dr. Lambert had been in surgery during the crucial time of Mallory's death, but his obsession with Mallory's work and his previous argument over the patent for a revolutionary surgical technique made him an obvious person of interest. Could his professional jealousy have escalated into something darker? And then there was Dr. Hawkins, whose strange behavior I had yet to fully understand. His movements during the days surrounding Mallory's death seemed too erratic, too hurried. Yet, like Armstrong, his alibi appeared flawless. He had been in the operating room with a patient at the time Mallory's death had been estimated to occur. But I had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. I found myself returning to Dr. Hawkins's office, for I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something important. The door was ajar, and I couldn't resist slipping inside quietly, my eyes scanning the room. It was cluttered with medical journals and patient files, but one particular document caught my eye. A post-it note, yellowed with age, was stuck to the back of a patient chart, written in a hurried hand. The words were simple but damning. I will make sure Mallory never sees the light of day again. A chill ran down my spine. Was this a coincidence, or had Hawkins been involved in something far darker than I had initially suspected? Just as I was about to examine the note further, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. I quickly replaced the chart and stepped back, hiding in the shadow of a nearby filing cabinet. Hawkins entered moments later, his face taut with tension. His gaze scanned the room, but fortunately he didn't notice the slight disturbance in the papers. He sat at his desk, running his hands through his hair, his brow furrowed in deep thought. It was clear that something was bothering him, but what? I stepped out quietly, my mind racing. The web was becoming more tangled by the moment, and yet one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Someone at this hospital was not just hiding a secret. They were actively concealing the truth. The clock was ticking, and the closer I got to the truth, the more dangerous the game seemed to become. Mallory had been silenced, but for what purpose? What had he known that was so threatening that someone was willing to murder him to keep it buried? The question lingered in the air as I walked out of Hawkins's office, my steps echoing in the empty hallway. Chapter 11. Breaking the Silence. The investigation had reached a crucial turning point, and the quiet hum of the hospital seemed to pulse with the weight of hidden secrets. Every conversation, every glance exchanged between the staff carried the potential to unravel the truth. Yet, despite the pieces of the puzzle I had gathered, I felt as though something still eluded me, lurking just beneath the surface. I had spent the better part of the afternoon combing through Dr. Lambert's office, carefully inspecting every file, every drawer, every paper that might give me insight into the man's involvement, or lack thereof, in Mallory's death. But I found nothing that directly tied him to the crime. There were no incriminating documents, no hidden notes, no pieces of evidence that screamed guilt. But there was something about Lambert's demeanor that remained unnerving. Something about the way he had spoken of Mallory and his colleagues, as though he were shielding himself from deeper scrutiny. It was time to confront him directly. I arranged to meet Dr. Lambert that evening. He was alone in his office, the walls lined with awards and diplomas, the faint scent of antiseptic clinging to the air. His sharp gaze met mine as I stepped into the room, and for the briefest of moments I saw a flicker of something, a mix of uncertainty and defiance, before he masked it with his usual confident facade. "Poirot," he greeted me, his voice steady, though I could detect a slight edge to it. "I trust you've come to discuss my alibi?" "No, mon ami," I replied, a smile curling at the corners of my lips. "We have discussed that already, and it holds up well. What I wish to discuss now is something much more personal." His brow furrowed, and I could see him stiffen slightly. "I'm not sure what you mean." I leaned forward, allowing my gaze to sharpen, to pierce through the professional exterior he had so carefully constructed. "You are a man of integrity, are you not, Dr. Lambert?" "I would like to think so," he answered carefully, but his voice was just a shade too defensive. "But integrity can be a fragile thing, no?" I said. "It can be easily compromised, especially under pressure."
And when one is faced with the prospect of losing everything one has worked for, well, that can lead to desperate actions, n'est-ce pas? Lambert's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. I could see the battle raging behind.
His eyes, whether to admit the truth or to maintain the illusion of innocence. I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "I have heard whispers, you see, Dr. Lambert. Whispers about your past, about alterations made to medical records to cover up mistakes. Simple errors, you would say, that would have caused undue harm to the reputation of the hospital, yes?" His gaze shifted, and for a moment I thought he might turn away, but he held firm. "I've admitted to some mistakes in the past," he said, his voice level. "But those were nothing more than minor misjudgments, mistakes that I corrected." "Corrected?" I repeated softly. "Or concealed?" Lambert's eyes flickered with anger, and he quickly regained his composure. "I have no idea what you're implying, Poirot. I've been nothing but transparent in my work." "I do not believe so," I said, letting the words hang in the air. "In fact, I believe there is much more to this story. And I believe you know far more about Mallory's death than you are letting on." He hesitated, his jaw tightening, as if he were grappling with whether to keep up the pretense or speak the truth. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I did alter."
"Records." "In the past," he admitted, his voice low. "But that was years ago. It was a different time."
"A time when I was trying to protect the reputation of this hospital, trying to prevent a scandal from spreading. We were understaffed, overworked. Things slipped through the cracks." "And did Mallory know of your actions?" I asked, studying his reaction closely. Lambert's face tightened, and he shifted uncomfortably. Mallory was an ambitious man. He was always looking for ways to climb higher, to push boundaries, and sometimes that meant digging into things he shouldn't.
have?
We had disagreements, professional disagreements, but nothing that would warrant what you're suggesting. But you had a motive, I pressed, watching him closely. A reason to want Mallory silenced, and I suspect he knew more than...
You think? Lambert stood up abruptly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I had nothing to do with his death, he snapped, his voice rising. I may have made mistakes in the past, but I didn't kill him. You think I'm some kind of monster? I don't need to resort to murder to protect my reputation.
I remained silent for a moment, my gaze steady on him. He was clearly rattled, and for a moment I wondered if I had pushed him too far. But then I saw something, the faintest hint of something in his eyes, something that suggested more than mere frustration. There was fear there, too. Fear of discovery, perhaps. I believe you, Lambert, I said softly, watching his shoulders relax. But I also believe you are hiding something. He narrowed his eyes as though sizing me up. And what would that be, Poirot? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I took a step back, casually running my hand along the edge of his desk. There, tucked beneath a pile of papers, was a letter. It wasn't just any letter, though. It was addressed to Lambert in Mallory's unmistakable handwriting. I picked it up carefully, the weight of it heavy in my hand. The letter had clearly been folded and unfolded many times. As I read through the contents, my eyes narrowed. The letter was a threat, plain and simple. Mallory had written it in response to something Lambert had done, something that had made Mallory's conscience stir. But the most damning part was the final line. If you don't stop what you're doing, Lambert, I will make sure you never practice medicine again. Your career, your life, everything you've worked for will be destroyed. You have been warned. Lambert's face went white as I placed the letter back down on the desk. He didn't speak at first, but the silence
spoke volumes. I had struck a nerve.
You see, Dr. Lambert, I said quietly, Mallory was no fool. He knew what was at stake, and it seems he had every intention of exposing you. Now tell me, how far would you go to keep your secrets buried? For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of our breathing. Then finally, Lambert broke the silence, his voice hoarse with emotion. I didn't kill him, he whispered, but I know who did. The words hung in the air, and for the first time in this entire investigation, I felt the pieces of the puzzle shift into place. Chapter 12. The patient's identity. I had left Dr. Lambert's office with more questions than answers, the faint echo of his final words still lingering in my mind. I know who did it. A cryptic statement, to be sure, but one that revealed more than he intended. There was something, or rather, someone else at play here, pulling the strings, manipulating the facts. Lambert, whether he was directly involved or not, had felt the sting of a dangerous truth, and now it was up to me to uncover what that truth was. I returned to the hospital with a renewed sense of urgency, certain that the key to unravelling this mystery lay in the tangled web of medical records and patient histories. Mallory's death had never made sense in the context of a suicide, and the more I dug, the more it became apparent that this was no ordinary case of negligence or error. It was a deliberate act, a game being played by someone with a dangerous agenda. The medical records of one particular patient kept coming to mind, Mr. Everson. He had been the original recipient of the surgery that Mallory was supposed to perform before his death. I knew that I had to revisit Everson's file to find out what, if anything, had been hidden in the patient's history. As I entered the hospital's records room, I was met with the familiar scent of sterilized air and the faint rustle of paper as the staff moved about. The room was quiet, save for the occasional murmur of a nurse or orderly passing by. I approached the desk where a nurse was working on updating a few charts. She gave me a polite smile as I leaned in, requesting access to Mr. Everson's records. "You're looking into Mr. Everson, Poirot?" she asked, her tone curious but polite. "His surgery was weeks ago. He was one of Dr. Mallory's cases." I nodded, my eyes narrowing. "Yes, indeed. I must admit I find myself intrigued by his medical history. Perhaps there is something I missed." She seemed to hesitate for a moment, as though unsure if she should allow me to delve deeper into the file. But then, with a small nod, she handed me the folder. "He's under Dr. Armstrong's care now, but if you'd like to look at his earlier records, they're all here." I sat down at the desk, flipping through the papers with practiced hands. At first glance, Everson's file appeared unremarkable, just another case of a middle-aged man requiring surgery. But as I moved deeper into the documentation, I found myself pausing on a set of notes from the weeks prior to Mallory's intended procedure. It was a small detail at first, barely noticeable, but it stood out in the context of my investigation. There was a notation that Everson had, in fact, passed away a few weeks earlier, before Mallory had ever performed the surgery. The report indicated that the cause of death was unclear, marked with an unsatisfactory, undetermined status. That was strange. If he had died weeks before Mallory's scheduled operation, why was his surgery still listed on the roster? A subtle yet unmistakable tension settled over me. There was more to this than met the eye. If Everson had died weeks ago, why had Mallory been preparing to operate on him? And more importantly, why had his medical records been altered to suggest that the procedure was still pending? This could not be a mere clerical error. Someone had intentionally misled the medical team. I leaned back in my chair, piecing together the puzzle. The only logical explanation was that Everson's death had not been accidental. Someone had orchestrated his demise and had gone to great lengths to ensure that the confusion surrounding his identity and medical history would continue. The question remained, who would benefit from such a deception? My mind raced through the possibilities, but a few key individuals stood out. Dr. Armstrong, who had inherited Everson's case, and Dr. Lambert, whose involvement with Mallory's past had raised suspicions. But neither of them seemed to be the mastermind I was searching for. I needed to dig deeper, to understand why this medical mix-up had been allowed to happen and who stood to gain the most from it. With a quiet resolve, I began scanning Everson's file more thoroughly, looking for anything that could shed light on the circumstances surrounding his mysterious death. I knew that I was not dealing with a simple case of medical negligence anymore. Someone had gone to great lengths to manipulate the truth, and now it was up to me to expose their motivations. As I continued to sift through the records, one name kept appearing in the margins: Dr. Hawkins. His name was listed several times in relation to Everson's care, and it was curious that I had not heard much about him during my previous inquiries. There was something about Hawkins's strange behavior around the time of Mallory's death, something that hadn't quite
added up in my mind.
Perhaps he had been hiding something, a secret that tied him to Everson's death and the events leading up to Mallory's own demise. I glanced at the clock on the wall. Time was slipping away. I needed to confront Hawkins, but before I did that, I decided to check one final detail. At the very bottom of Everson's file was a recent update, a note about a private consultation between Dr. Armstrong and an undisclosed party regarding the deceased patient's complex case. The note was vague, but it suggested that there was more going on than the hospital had let on. I stood, the files still open in front of me, my mind swirling with the implications. If someone had deliberately manipulated the records to confuse Mallory's intended surgery with a dead man's history, it meant that there was a deliberate attempt to hide something. But what was it? What did Everson know that could have been so dangerous? As I left the records room, my thoughts raced ahead, piecing together the events that had led to Mallory's death. Someone was orchestrating a cover-up, but who was pulling the strings? And why? Every step I took seemed to lead me closer to a singular conclusion, one that was both terrifying and inevitable. I had to speak with Dr. Hawkins, but I also had to be cautious. There was a dark thread running through this investigation, one that seemed to connect the dots in ways I hadn't fully grasped until now. I made my way to Hawkins's office, each step bringing me closer to uncovering the final piece of the puzzle. My instincts told me that the key to everything lay within the twisted details of Everson's case. But what lay hidden in the dark corners of Hawkins's past? The answer, I suspected, would be far more sinister than I could have imagined. Chapter 13. The Unraveling. The quiet hum of the hospital, normally a familiar and comforting sound, now felt oppressive as I walked toward Dr. Hawkins's office. My mind was a maze of possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. The pieces of the puzzle had slowly started to come together, and yet the final image eluded me. Who had orchestrated Mallory's death, and why had they gone to such lengths to cover it up? The door to Hawkins's office was slightly ajar, and I knocked lightly before entering. The doctor sat behind his desk, his expression weary but composed, a stark contrast to the nervous energy that had been swirling in my mind. He looked up, meeting my gaze with a calmness that seemed, in this context, almost too perfect. "Poirot," he greeted me, his voice steady, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something, anxiety perhaps, or guilt. "What brings you here today?" "I am afraid I have a few more questions, Doctor," I said, my voice measured but firm. "Questions that I believe only you can answer." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk, the faintest signs of unease creeping into his posture. "I've answered all of your questions already," he replied, though there was a slight edge to his tone now. I took a step closer, placing a small stack of papers on his desk, the same medical records I had pored over only hours before. "There is something that does not quite sit right with me, Dr. Hawkins. The case of Mr. Everson. He was supposed to have died weeks ago, yet his surgery was still scheduled with Mallory. This does not add up. Someone deliberately misled the team, and I believe you may know why." His eyes darted to the papers, then back to me. For a moment he said nothing, as if weighing his next words carefully. But there was a shift in his demeanor, an awareness that his silence would only raise further suspicion. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I suppose it was only a matter of time before you discovered the truth," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've tried to keep it buried, but it's all coming undone now, isn't it?" I nodded, though my mind raced ahead. The truth. What was it that Hawkins knew that had led him to such a desperate state? "You were blackmailed," I said, softly, my words precise. "By Dr. Mallory. He had something over you, didn't he?" Hawkins's face paled at the mention of Mallory's name, and for a brief moment he seemed to lose control of his composure. He ran a hand through his hair, his breath quickening. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he murmured, almost as though speaking to himself. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." I stepped closer, the air thick with tension. "Tell."
"Me, Doctor. What did Mallory have on you?" Hawkins hesitated, glancing nervously toward the window as though considering whether anyone could overhear. He finally spoke, his voice strained. It was a mistake, a surgical error.
It happened during a routine procedure. A young woman, nothing serious, but I made a mistake. I didn't notice it in time. She died on the operating table, and Mallory was the one who covered it up. He threatened me. Said he'd ruin my career if I ever spoke about it. He wanted me to keep quiet, to protect him, and He stopped himself, his words hanging in the air. I couldn't risk it, he whispered. I couldn't afford to lose everything. Mallory's grip on Hawkins's life had been more than just a professional mistake. It had been a threat to his very livelihood. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as the implications of this revelation became clear. Mallory had been a man, willing to cover up death, to silence anyone who dared to expose his faults. But it seemed that Hawkins wasn't the only one who had something to hide. Mallory wanted to be sure, didn't he? I asked, my voice low. He wanted to ensure that the truth about his own mistakes stayed buried, even if it meant using
You as a pawn, Hawkins nodded, his face tight with shame. He was ruthless, Poirot. But I never thought he'd go this far. I never thought he'd... He stopped again, his eyes wide with fear, as though a terrifying thought had just occurred.
To him. No, it couldn't be. He wouldn't have... But he did, I said, my words cutting through the air with a sharp finality. Dr. Mallory's death was not an accident. Someone wanted him silenced forever. And I believe you are right to be afraid, Dr. Hawkins. But it is not just you who should fear.
It is everyone in this hospital who has something to lose. He stared at me, the weight of my words settling over him. You think it was someone here, someone in the hospital? I am certain of it, I replied, my eyes narrowing as I continued.
The timing of Mallory's death was too precise, too calculated. Whoever did this knew exactly when and how to strike. They had a plan, and it was executed with surgical precision. But there's more. There is someone who stands to gain far more from Mallory's death than just a quiet career. Hawkins looked at me, his expression a mix of confusion and fear. Who? I turned away for a moment, my thoughts turning inward. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still something crucial missing. Why Mallory? Why now? It wasn't just about a surgical mistake or blackmail. No, this was a bigger game, and someone had orchestrated Mallory's death as part of a much more elaborate scheme. Dr. Armstrong, I said at last, my voice calm, but with a certainty that could not be ignored. He is the one who stands to gain the most from Mallory's death, the promotion, the power, the control over the hospital. Mallory was in his way, and now with him gone, Armstrong can step into his place without anyone looking too closely. Hawkins's face tightened at the mention of Armstrong's name. Armstrong, he repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. But why? He couldn't. He could, I said, firmly, turning back to face him. Armstrong
is a man of ambition, Dr. Hawkins. He saw Mallory as a threat, someone who stood between him and his goals.
And when Mallory's secret came to light, when his reputation was on the line, Armstrong took action. He orchestrated everything. Hawkins's face drained of colour as the truth settled in. But the blackmail, Mallory's mistake. Mallory was playing a dangerous game, I said softly, almost pityingly. He thought he could control everyone around him, but in the end it was his own pride that led to his downfall. And now, someone is making sure the truth stays buried. I turned to leave Hawkins's office, my thoughts racing. I had no time to waste. Everything was pointing to one final confrontation. Armstrong had played his hand, and now the pieces of the puzzle were finally aligned. I had one last question to answer. Would Armstrong be brave enough to face the
consequences of his actions? But as I reached the door, a final thought stopped me dead in my tracks.
Someone else knew the truth. Someone else had been complicit in the conspiracy. The question was, who? I stepped out of the office, my mind consumed with the realization that the web I had uncovered was far more intricate than I had ever imagined. The investigation was about to take a dangerous turn, and I had no choice but to follow it to the bitter end. Chapter 14. The final twist. Stood before the large conference room at the hospital, the silence thick with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. The suspects were all gathered, seated in their respective chairs, each person seemingly unaware of the truth that was about to come crashing down upon them. Dr. Hawkins sat at the front, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his face pale, still haunted by the confession he had made only hours before. But now, the final pieces of the puzzle were within my grasp. As I surveyed the group, I allowed myself a moment to gather my thoughts. Dr. Armstrong was seated to the right, his posture rigid, eyes darting around the room as if he were trying to gauge my next move. Nurse Westfield, ever so calm, sat near the back, her expression inscrutable, though I could sense an underlying tension in the way she fidgeted with the sleeve of her uniform. And then there was Dr. Mallory's former colleague, Dr. McAllister, who had remained strangely distant throughout the investigation, almost as if he had been a mere observer rather than an active participant. I had kept my suspicions to myself for a long time, carefully piecing together each clue, each subtle inconsistency. It had taken me hours of quiet reflection, but now the time had come to expose the truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice calm yet carrying an authority that demanded attention. "I have gathered you here today because I believe I have solved the mystery of Dr. Mallory's death. The man who was thought to be the victim of a tragic surgical error was, in fact, murdered. And the identity of the murderer, well, that is something none of you could have predicted." I paused, watching the room's reaction. A few faces stiffened in surprise, while others glanced nervously at one another. Hawkins shifted in his chair, his discomfort palpable. "The death of Dr. Mallory," I continued, "was not the result
of some random act of fate or a surgical mistake. No, it was a meticulously planned crime, and it was designed to look like an accident, a mistake that no one would suspect. But what I have discovered is far more complex than that." I turned
to face Dr. Armstrong, who was sitting at the center of the room, his gaze fixed on me with a mixture of defiance and curiosity. "Dr. Armstrong," I said, locking eyes with him, "it seems that you too have been playing a very dangerous game. You thought Mallory's death would serve your interests, didn't you?" His lips curled into a tight smile, but it was a smile that failed to reach his eyes. "I don't know what you mean, Poirot," he replied coolly. "Dr. Mallory's death was tragic, yes, but I hardly see how it could have anything to do with me." I could almost hear the calculated calm in his voice. But I was not deceived. "Oh, but it does," I said softly. "You wanted him out of the picture, didn't you? Mallory was a threat to your position here. He was ambitious, yes, but so are you, Dr. Armstrong. You saw an opportunity, and you seized it." There was a slight shift in Armstrong's expression, but he quickly regained his composure. "I had nothing to do with Mallory's death, Poirot. That's absurd." "I disagree," I replied. "You had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. You were both in the operating room together on the day of the procedure. You both had access to the medical records, and you both knew the stakes. but I'm afraid it wasn't just a matter of ambition. No, there was more to it than that. I let the words hang in the air for a moment, watching as Armstrong's eyes flickered with a trace of panic. He was trying to maintain control, but it was slipping through his fingers. "Dr. Armstrong," I said, my voice gaining strength. It was not an accident. The mistake was deliberate. Someone wanted to confuse the identities. They wanted to mislead the entire team to make sure that the wrong person would be blamed for Mallory's death. His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might speak, but he remained silent, unwilling to reveal too much too soon. "I have come to believe," I continued, "that the one person who could have orchestrated this is not who you might think. It is not you, Dr. Armstrong. It is someone far closer to the heart of this mystery. Someone who had more than just a passing interest in Mallory's demise." I turned to face Nurse Westfield, who had remained remarkably composed throughout the conversation. "Nurse Westfield," I said, my eyes narrowing as I looked at her. "You were more involved than you let on. You knew Mallory better than anyone here, didn't you? You knew his flaws, his weaknesses, and his secrets. And I believe that it was your knowledge that led you to make the fatal decision." For the first time since I had entered the room, Westfield's expression faltered. Her hands clenched in her lap, and I could see the subtle tremor in her fingers.
"I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice sounding strained. I shook my head slowly. "Oh, but you do. You knew about Mallory's blackmail of Dr. Hawkins. You knew that Mallory was capable of ruining lives without a second thought. And you knew that he had made enemies, powerful enemies. You saw the cracks in his character, and you knew how to exploit them." Westfield's breath hitched.
Her cool demeanor was slipping, and I could see the guilt creeping into her eyes. She was hiding something far darker than I had anticipated. "You thought you could get away with it?" I pressed, my voice low and unwavering. "You thought that by eliminating Mallory you could tie up all the loose ends. You had the perfect plan, a plan that until now no one had uncovered." Westfield's eyes darted to the others in the room, and for a fleeting moment I saw panic. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough. "It was you, wasn't it?" I asked softly, leaning in just a fraction. "You killed Mallory." Westfield's face crumpled as the weight of the truth hit her. She looked down at her hands, and for a long moment there was no sound in the room except the pounding of her own heart. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never meant for it to go this far." "You killed him because you believed you could get away with it," I said, my words a quiet condemnation. "But the truth has a way of revealing itself, Nurse Westfield. And now the game is over." She sat back in her chair, defeated. Her shoulders slumped, and she finally let go of the carefully constructed facade she had built. "It wasn't supposed to end like this. I never thought—" I turned away, allowing the silence to stretch for just a moment longer. Then I addressed the others in the room, my eyes sweeping over them with a finality that could not be ignored. The wrong man was never the real mistake. The true mistake was thinking you could all hide in the shadows, but now you will all face the consequences. As I left the room, I could feel the weight of the case lifting from my shoulders. The mystery had been solved, but the question remained: how many more lies could one person weave before the threads finally unraveled completely? The investigation had come to an end, but in truth, the game was only just beginning for those who had been part of it. Chapter 15. The Grand Denouement. The room was quiet as the last of the tension dissolved into an uneasy silence. Nurse Westfield's confession had been a hard blow to the others in the room, but it was only a small piece of the puzzle. She had killed Dr. Mallory, yes, but she had done so with the help of another. There was one more step left to this unraveling, and I knew that the final piece would be the one that would make it all fall into place. I sat down slowly, my fingers tapping against the wooden surface of the conference table. I had spent days considering every angle, every conversation, and every action. Now the time had come to lay the final truth bare. "Mon cher, you are not as clever as you think," I said, turning my gaze back to the group. They watched me with varying degrees of apprehension, their eyes darting between one another. "I am afraid that the mystery is not as simple as Nurse Westfield's actions alone." I noticed Dr. Armstrong shift uncomfortably in his chair, his jaw clenching, but his silence was telling. He had already been exposed to the core, but there was something else at play. The others had been distracted by Westfield's confession, but I had not lost sight of the bigger picture. Dr. Hawkins, still reeling from the events that had unfolded, looked to me with uncertainty. His gaze was full of guilt, but also a mixture of confusion and hope. It was as if he wanted me to tell him that his worst fears weren't true. But, alas, they were. And I would not spare him the harshness of truth. I could hear my own voice, steady and unwavering, cutting through the atmosphere. Like a blade, it is always in the most carefully crafted of schemes that the cracks begin to show, n'est-ce pas? You see, the murder of Dr. Mallory was not an impulsive act. No, this was something much more sinister, something that required a calculated
mind and careful precision. Someone who knew how to manipulate those around him to make them believe in the wrong narrative. I paused, watching their faces, searching for the slightest flicker of recognition. It was Dr. Lambert, of course. He had been the one pulling the strings from the beginning. "Dr. Lambert," I said, finally allowing his name to hang in the air. He stiffened immediately, his face pale, his eyes narrowing, but he said nothing.
"You were always one step ahead of the rest of us, weren't you?" Dr. Lambert shifted in his chair, trying to maintain his composure, but his nerves betrayed him. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, knuckles turning white. "I don't know what you're talking about, Poirot," he said, his voice, too, tight to be convincing. "Oh, but I am sure you do. You see, it was you who orchestrated the botched surgery that killed Dr. Mallory. It was you who ensured that the procedure was doomed to fail from the start, all to cover up your true objective. And that objective, as I have deduced, was not just to harm Mallory, no, it was to steal his research." The room was still. Even Nurse Westfield seemed to shrink back, no longer able to meet anyone's gaze. "You were aware of Mallory's work on the groundbreaking medical procedure, weren't you, Dr. Lambert?" I asked, my voice calm, almost
gentle. He had discovered a method that would have revolutionized the field. And you, my friend, saw that as an opportunity. But only if Mallory were no longer around to stake his claim. Dr. Lambert's face darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line.
"That's ridiculous. You have no proof of that." "No proof?" I leaned forward, my eyes narrowing as I studied him closely. "I do not need proof when the pattern is so clear. You had access to Mallory's research. You knew that if Mallory were removed from the picture, the path to fame and success would be wide open for you. But there was one problem. Mallory's research was too valuable. You couldn't risk it falling into the wrong hands." I let that sink in for a moment, watching Dr. Lambert's expression flicker with what could only be described as hesitation. The man was a master of deception, but his facade was beginning to crack. You knew, I continued, that Mallory's death would create confusion. You knew that everyone would assume it was simply a surgical mistake. And that is exactly
how you set the stage.
The botched surgery, the mistaken diagnosis, all carefully arranged to point away from you. Dr. Lambert's fingers twitched, and I saw him swallow hard. But there was no escape now. The web had been woven too tightly, and the strands were pulling together. I stood and began to pace slowly, my hands clasped behind my back. It was not a coincidence that Mallory's death occurred after a series of small errors. You knew that all it would take was one mistake, one seemingly insignificant slip-up, and Mallory's fate would be sealed. It was a simple matter of ensuring the mistake was made in the operating room, where the blame would fall squarely on others. And then, when the investigation turned to focus on Nurse Westfield and Dr. Hawkins, you could walk away scot-free.
After all, who would suspect the doctor who had been so helpful in unravelling the mess? I turned to face him, my eyes piercing through his defence. But here is where you made your fatal error, Dr. Lambert. You underestimated me. You underestimated my little grey cells. He opened his mouth, but no words came. I took a step toward him, my voice lowering to a near whisper.
I knew that the murderer was someone who had the opportunity, the means, and the motive. You were all under my suspicion at one point, but it was you who fit the pattern most perfectly. Your involvement with the surgery, your knowledge of Mallory's work, and, perhaps most importantly, the fact that you were in the right position to cover your tracks. You created the perfect alibi by manipulating the investigation. You even managed to fool your colleagues. He remained silent, his chest heaving with shallow breaths, but there was no denying the truth any longer. You killed Mallory not out of personal animosity, but for your own ambition, I said softly, as though I was speaking to an old acquaintance. You saw an opportunity to take the glory for yourself, and you took it, no matter the cost. The silence in the room was oppressive, suffocating even. No one dared to speak as Dr. Lambert's shoulders slumped in defeat. There was no pride left in his eyes, only the hollow recognition
of his own guilt.
You will not escape justice, I said, and my words echoed with finality. Not this time. As I turned to leave, I could feel the weight of the case lifting from my shoulders, the lingering fog of uncertainty clearing. The mystery had been solved, the murderer had been exposed, and the pieces of the puzzle had finally clicked into place. But even as I stepped away, there was a lingering thought that tickled the back of my mind. The truth had been revealed, but the consequences of this revelation were far from over. As Poirot always said, justice may be served, but its aftermath is something to be reckoned with.